If some government food agency or sandwich shop kept assuring you that this was chicken noodle soup, but kept serving you this sandwich instead, at what point would you start to question the legitimacy of that claim? In order to understand the logical fallacies in the thinking of big pharma-sponsored virologists and see the obvious flaws in the Petri dish experiments they use as proof that their unproven germ theory is possibly correct, we need to go back in time again and ask, what is polio, and what caused the Spanish flu, if not germs? Dr. Eleanor McBean was actually there, as were her two doctor parents and colleagues who were healing the victims. According to them, ironically, the Spanish flu pandemic was caused by multiple toxic vaccines, kept alive with the addition of more poisonous drugs administered by the doctors who tried to suppress the symptoms caused by the vaccines themselves. We know that the Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research carried out a large-scale bacterial meningitis vaccination campaign in the U.S. Army in 1917 and 1918, supervised by Frederick Lamont Gates, under supervision of his father, Frederick Taylor Gates. We can see one of the published studies carried out on soldiers in Fort Riley, Kansas, in late 1917, the start of the Spanish flu pandemic, where soldiers were being given 3 increasing dosage amounts of bacterial meningitis vaccines in 4 to 10-day intervals. Even if you are ignorantly pro-vax, would you go out and take 3 increasing doses of polio, flu shots, or COVID-19 vaccinations in 2 weeks? They called it the Spanish flu, yet Spain remained neutral in World War I, and German submarines patrolled their coast, so the U.S. didn't even have soldiers and bases in Spain. It also took 6 to 8 days just to sail troops home from France to the U.S., never mind the extra time to get home to the other states and bases. Yet, the first reported Spanish flu cases all broke out in the exact same time, not in Europe, but all around the United States, shown here in green and yellow, even in Southern California and, of course, Fort Riley, Kansas. When you lay the map of important U.S. military bases where mass vaccinations were taking place over the outbreak map, they match exactly. Dr. McBean's research into military vaccination records uncovered that they were not only giving these soldiers bacterial meningitis vaccines. That was only one of the 14 to 25 different shots given to the soldiers. As we ourselves have just seen, after a COVID-19 vaccine safety data document that they had hoped to remain sealed for 75 years was published, showing on page 30 a 9-page list of over 1,300 diseases already caused by just one COVID-19 vaccine worldwide, and that's just from one manufacturer. So what kind of diseases were these soldiers getting from a combination of 14 to 25 different vaccines at once? Many of the soldiers were insane from post-vaccinal encephalitis, but the doctors called it shell shock, even though many of the soldiers had never left American soil. The conglomerate disease brought on by the 14 to 25 poisonous vaccines baffled the doctors, as they had never had a vaccination spree before, which used so many different vaccines. The vaccines brought on high fever, extreme weakness, abdominal rash, and intestinal disturbances, characteristic of typhoid. The diphtheria vaccine caused lung congestion, chills and fever, swollen sore throat, clogged with the false membrane, and the choking suffocation because of difficulty in breathing, followed by gasping and death, after which the body turned black from stagnant blood that had been deprived of oxygen in the suffocation stages. In the early days, they called it Black Death. Does this look like any flu symptoms you've ever experienced or seen in your life? The other vaccines caused their own reactions, paralysis or polio, brain damage, lockjaw, and more. When doctors had tried to suppress the symptoms of vaccine-induced typhoid with a stronger vaccine, it caused a worse form of typhoid, which they named paratyphoid. But when they concocted an even stronger and more dangerous vaccine to suppress that one, they created an even worse disease, which they didn't even have a name for. They didn't want to tell people what it really was. Their own Frankenstein monster, which they themselves had created with their vaccines and suppressive medicines. They wanted to shift the blame away from their vaccines, so they called it the Spanish influenza, which explains the soldiers. But what about the regular civilian people? Did this maskless body collector know the truth? That the First World War was of a short duration, so the vaccine makers were unable to use up all of their vaccines on the soldiers, so they decided to sell it to the rest of the population. They drummed up the largest vaccination campaign in U.S. history. Their propaganda claimed the soldiers were coming home from countries with all kinds of contagious diseases, and that everyone must have all of the shots on the market. The people believed them. First of all, they wanted to believe their doctors, just like today. And second, the returning soldiers certainly had been sick from their vaccines. So no, a virus or bacteria did not cause the Spanish flu, and vaccines did not eradicate it. Vaccines caused it. And once they were sold out of vaccines, the pandemic instantly stopped. But what is more interesting about Dr. McBean and her doctor parents living through the Spanish flu pandemic is that their testimony, too, debunks the contagion myth. She tells us that the flu hit only the vaccinated. Those who had refused the shots escaped the flu. Her family had refused all the vaccinations, so they all remained well all the time. Hers seemed to be the only family which didn't get the flu. So her doctor parents went from house to house doing what they could to look after the sick, as it was impossible to get a doctor then. Just like the failed contagion experiments we've already discussed, if it were possible for germs, bacteria, virus, or bacilli to cause disease, they had plenty of opportunity to attack her parents when they were spending many hours every day in the sick rooms. But they didn't get the flu, and they didn't bring any germs home to attack the children and cause anything. None of her family had the flu, not even a sniffle, and it was in the winter with deep snow on the ground. Only the vaccinated died. Then we have the strange case of the two Russian conjoined twins, Masha and Dasha, who each had their own lungs and organs, but because their circulatory systems were interconnected, they shared the same blood. Dasha was always prone to colds, but not Masha. And as children, one would become ill with a childhood disease like measles, while the other would not. If the measles was a bug, it would have been in both of their bodies and in their collective bloodstream. So why didn't they both get the measles? This phenomenon was seen over and over again with the girls. Flus, colds, and other childhood diseases were all experienced separately, never together, which would explain why neither Dr. Sellards of Johns Hopkins nor Dr. Hess of New York were able to transmit measles or chickenpox in all of their experiments, because germ theory is nonsense pseudoscience.